Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's event, a high-level dialogue on strengthening NDCs from Dubai to Belem. We'll be starting in about 1 minute so that we can allow more people to join, and we'll get going then. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. I am David Wasco, the Director of the International Climate Action Initiative at the World Resources Institute. And I'm delighted today to be moderating our discussion from Dubai to Belem, a high-level dialogue on strengthening national climate commitments. We have a truly outstanding and distinguished panel today. I'm very excited to have them with us. And on behalf of all of us, welcome. Just to get us started, let me provide some initial remarks, and then we'll turn to the panelists. Just 2 months ago, COP28, as I think many of you know, concluded with the culmination of the world's first ever global stocktake under the Paris Agreement. And that outcome urged nations to step forward and to submit their fresh national climate commitments that are meant to come well before the arrival of COP30, which will be at the end of 2025. These plans, known as NDCs, serve as indispensable roadmaps and detail the measures each country pledges that they will take to combat the climate crisis. And with this next round, countries are expected to present new targets for 2035 and also, importantly, to update their 2030 targets. Now, as we approach this next phase, this next round of NDCs, the demand for both implementation and setting ambitious goals is sounding louder than ever before. And the Global Stocktake outcome is meant to inform that action and ambition that countries reflect in their NDCs. The decision reached at COP28 highlights the pressing need to reduce worldwide emissions by 60% from 2019 levels by 2035 in order to prevent exceeding the 1.5 degree limit. The Global Stocktake also set some other important global objectives across energy, transport, nature, sustainable consumption, and more that will be essential to take into account as countries prepare their NDCs. And to pursue the climate transformation the world needs, we also need to keep in mind that the next round of NDCs is a key moment to include strategies for adaptation, for addressing loss and damage, and for just transition efforts. Since the last round of NDCs that we saw starting in 2019, leading up to COP26, the world looks a lot different. We've borne witness to record-breaking heat waves and devastating climate disasters. Geopolitics complicates the task ahead, as sometimes does domestic politics. Yet recent research from the IEA gives us cause for hope. It reveals the spectacular growth in renewables in 2023, with projections indicating a continued upward trajectory through the decade. And electric vehicles also are charging ahead, including 2 and 3 wheelers, for example, in some countries. So as the development of the new NDCs gets underway in earnest now, looking ahead about a year out, with that window when the NDCs will be submitted rapidly approaching, how will these dynamics shape NDCs? How do we crystallize the ambition that we need? And how do we lay the groundwork for robust, action-oriented, and transformational plans? Those are the questions that we want to discuss today, and we have a terrific panel to tackle these critical questions. On the panel, we have, I'll start with Toni, who is the National Secretary for Climate Change at the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change in Brazil. Then Thomas Anker Christensen, who is the Climate Ambassador for Denmark, among other hats that he wears. Laura Kotze, Director of Sustainability, Technology, and Outlooks at the International Energy Agency. And lastly, Taryn Franzen, Director of Science Research and Data for the Climate Program at WRI. We're going to leave plenty of time for questions and answers, and I encourage you to submit questions at any time using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And of course, the recording of the webinar will be available on the event page within coming days. So before kicking off our panel discussion, I'd like to invite Taryn to do a little scene setting for us. She's been focused on countries' NDCs since their inception nearly a decade ago. And Taryn, what I want to pose as a question and as a scene setter is, after almost 10 years of observing this, how far have NDCs taken us? In what ways do we urgently need transformative shifts? And how can NDCs best meet those demands? So over to you, Toni.
Thank you, David. When countries came together in 2015 to negotiate the Paris Agreement, global greenhouse gas emissions were rising with really no end in sight, and we were on track for warming of more than 3.5 degrees Celsius. Over the past decade, I think this picture has changed more dramatically than we sometimes realize, thanks in part to the commitments that countries made under Paris. The figure on the left here shows projected global emissions over the time period from 2015 to 2030. So in this chart, each line represents a projection that was made in the given year that's labeled on the right. So the darkest line drawn in 2015 shows emissions continuing to rise through 2030, which is what they were expected to do based on the policies that were in place at that time. The lightest line at the bottom, drawn in 2022, shows that emissions are now projected to be lower in 2030 than they were in 2015. So that's a dramatic change in projected emissions. That progress on emissions, of course, also implies progress for global temperature. So the figure on the right shows how much we're expected to warm throughout the course of this century. In 2015, if countries had continued implementing the policies they had in place back then, we would have been on track for around 3.5 degrees of warming, as shown there in the yellow line in 2015. And that estimate now has fallen by nearly 1 degree Celsius. So if we succeed in implementing our NDC targets, which are a little bit more ambitious than countries' current domestic policies, warming would be around 2.5 degrees. And if we also succeed in implementing our net zero emissions targets, we could limit warming at closer to 2 degrees. And this really reflects, I think, the efforts that countries have made over the last decade to strengthen their commitments. In the lead up to COP26, as David noted, more than 100 countries strengthened the ambition of their 2030 emissions reduction targets, and countries also nearly doubled the number of adaptation actions that they were targeting in their NDCs. But despite that progress, we still have a long way to go to close the gap between countries' policies and their targets, and moreover, between the targets that they've set and the 1.5 degree goal. And I think we can't understate or gloss over what a huge gap this still is. While we have made important progress since 2015, the progress is really incremental relative to the transformative change that needs to occur. The need for this transformative change, I think, is reflected in a couple of developments that have that have happened just since Glasgow and COP26. So first of all, at COP26, countries noted the need to align their NDCs with long-term strategies towards a just transition to net zero. So I think that identifies that the net zero orientation that we need to see in the next round of NDCs. And in fact, most countries now have set net zero targets. So this next round of NDCs, I think, provides an opportunity to align near and midterm targets with these very ambitious long-term goals. And for most countries, this will be the first round of NDCs that they will have submitted since they set those goals to reach net zero emissions. The second point, as David alluded to, is that in Dubai, countries concluded the first global stocktake, which is that global reckoning of progress towards Paris Agreement goals. And the Paris Agreement actually stipulates that countries need to take account of this global stocktake outcome as they develop their NDCs. That's part of its purpose, is to orient that next round of NDCs. And that outcome contained some interesting guidance, I think, around the need to transition away from fossil fuels and to triple clean energy capacity by 2030. That if countries take these points seriously in their NDCs, then we'll need to see something much different that we saw in the last round. So the question then becomes, I think, how can we harness this instrument of the NDCs, which are coming up right away, to advance this kind of transformative change that we need to see? And I'm sure our panelists will speak to this in much more detail. But I wanted to just kick things off by mentioning a couple of guiding principles. So first, we need these NDCs to set sights on a just transition to net zero. For countries whose emissions are already declining, that might mean showing how the NDC and the actions it proposes will drive down emissions even faster. And for countries whose emissions are still rising, that might mean showing how the NDC will contribute to peaking emissions as soon as possible and then declining as fast as possible. And secondly, we need to be sure that the NDC process is action-oriented, that it's ready to spur implementation by focusing the attention of government officials, by empowering climate advocates within and outside of government, by acting as a catalyst for finance and investment, and by really signaling a direction of travel in a credible way to ministries, companies, and investors. So NDCs could perhaps play this role by spelling out not only economy-wide emissions reduction targets, but what needs to happen in more detail in the critical sectors and subsectors, and by engaging key ministries and stakeholders in that process. They could serve as an occasion to articulate the finance and investment required and how it can be mobilized. And finally, governments could use the catalyst provided by the NDCs to strengthen domestic climate institutions to support delivery. And I think if we see all of those ingredients coming together, then we have a real opportunity to shift course and point things in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tarn, for setting the scene so well. And we're now going to turn to our panel and get their reflections on where we go with NDCs. And I'm going to start with Thomas. Let me begin by saying that I think you were very involved in the process of the negotiations at the end of COP28 for the Global Stocktake. Denmark co-facilitated those talks at Dubai. And you've also just begun sharing the NDC partnership together with Rwanda. And the partnership will offer support for NDC work based on the guidance offered by the Global Stocktake. So to kick us off with this discussion, how do you think countries should integrate the outcome of the Global Stocktake into their next round of NDCs?
Thank you, David and WRI for inviting us to this very timely discussion. I think, at least for us, it's the first time that we engage publicly on these questions since Dubai. And we look forward to working very closely with our Brazilian friends in unpacking this challenge. I don't think there are any easy answers to the difficult questions, but it's a lot of hard work and it's a collective endeavor, I think, of governments to, well, try to understand what we actually decided in Dubai and then transform it into that guidance for ourselves, for our NDCs. it's correct what Tanya is saying, that the NDCs have to be informed by the outcome of the global stocktake, but it's also very clear from the Paris Agreement and the whole fabric of the way we do climate action that it is a national determined contribution. So it's up to every country how they interpret the outcome of the global stocktake and how they translate it into national policies and legislations. And in that sense, the criticism of any UN text is often that it's too soft, it's not legally binding, it doesn't go far enough. But we actually think that the global stocktake text goes very far in giving guidance and direction to countries in terms of where they need to go. And both you, David, and Tanya mentioned some of the elements. There's an encouragement to do economy-wide emission reduction targets for all parties, to look at all greenhouse gases, to align these targets with 1.5, and then also make sure that the long-term strategies are aligned with the short-term planning. And we think that this has to be a joint exercise of learning. No government has the answers itself, and that's also why in a way the energy piece of the global stocktake, which received most attention, it reads a little bit like a to-do list on energy transition. Laura and the IEA have helped us also last year with a number of elements that we could do to be on a 1.5 degree track. And in a way, Laura, many of the elements, or maybe all of the elements that were in the IEA's analysis, are reflected in the mitigation part of the global stocktake, both on renewable energy efficiency, phasing out fossil fuels, but also when it comes to methane, carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, even the nuclear piece. I mean, all these elements are in there. But then in addition, we also have the first attempt at operationalizing the global goal on adaptation, which breaks adaptation for the first time down into its components of water, food, ecosystems, biodiversity, resilient infrastructure, social protection, etc., etc. And it asks us to do national adaptation plans by 2030 to look at multi-hazard systems and really also focusing on implementing the adaptation dimension and the loss and damage. And I think that has gone a bit under the radar in the discussion of the global stocktake, that there actually is an elaborate pitch on what adaptation could look like. There's still some work that needs to be done for coming up with indicators on adaptation, but it goes pretty far. And then this year we will be focusing on finance, and we know that many governments are maybe waiting with beginning their NDC work because they will see what the outcome of the finance discussion will be. But putting up on my NDC partnership hat, and for those of you who don't know what the NDC partnership it is a collaborative platform between the major institutions in the global system that help countries on NDCs. So it says the UN, multilateral development banks, IRENA, etc., as institutions, and then it has donor governments, and then there are about somewhere between 70 and 90 developing countries that have asked for the support from the partnership. But the point I'm getting to is that until now, no government has actually asked the NDC partnership for support in developing their next NDC. And that is a bit concerning, because while you wait for the financing, there's a lot of data collection, there's a lot of initial work to do a detailed NDC that needs to start now. And if all, say, 90 countries that work with the NDC partnership come all at once after COP29 to get support, we will have a difficulty in handling all of them. So for those governments from countries who are interested in receiving support for doing their NDC, I would say approach the NDC partnership as soon as you feel comfortable doing so, because it will take quite some detailed analytical work to help you on developing your NDC. And finally, last element, David, in the follow-up section of the Global Stocktake, there is a mandate for Brazil already to become engaged as part of a new development called the Troika. And there is the mentioning of a Troika consisting of the current COP presidency, the COP29 presidency, and the COP30 presidency, who are being asked to work together on a mission 1.5, and which in a way also then ties the ambition of the Global Stocktake with the financing, with the delivery of the NDCs. And we haven't seen that kind of mandate for the COP presidencies to work together before. So it's in a way also, I think, an attempt by us as parties to the COP to help ourselves to get more structure and continuity into our work. And by giving Brazil already now a task of helping to steer this while there's still some time until you assume your role as president. So Anna, we very much look forward to Brazil's leadership on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thomas. And thank you for the perfect segue to Anna. We're clearly on this trajectory right now, excuse me, from Dubai to Belem at the end of 2025. We go through COP29 in Baku as well this year. So what do you see as Brazil's role? What is Brazil planning to help move the process forward, both in terms of the national climate commitments and NDCs themselves, as well as the broader context for taking stronger climate action?
Thank you so much, David. Thank you, WRI, for having this meeting. It's so important for us to start talking about NDCs now. Really nice to see some friends. Nice to see you, Thomas, and other friends here. So as Thomas alluded to, this innovation about the Troika, COP28, COP29, and COP30 already working together. And we are already working together. Since COP28, we already had at least 2 meetings that we discussed what mission 1.5, how we are going to focus, and the focus obviously on NDCs. So I see a lot of continuity. I think COP28 has been really good to now set the bar on the consensus of the Emirates to see what we need to do. Deciding on economy-wide NDCs, that the next NDCs will be economy-wide, was a great achievement for COP28. But we have been discussing that a lot, and I think Taryn mentioned that we need to go for the next NDCs. From our perspective, is helping countries to go beyond just the targets. Yes, ambitious targets, economy-wide, will be very, very important. But as we learn from the Global Stocktake, there is a big also gap between some of the graphics that was shown to us by Taryn before, between the targets that countries have and the implementation of those targets. We are really lagging behind, not only on the targets, but mainly also on implementation. So I think we needed 2 things. And working with COP presidency from Dr. Sultan and with our colleagues from Azerbaijan, we needed to make sure that the next round of NDCs that we call next generation NDCs or NDCs 2.0, that we will have targets, but above all, we need to have very detailed implementation plans that will catalyze investments, public and private, as well showing the gaps on capacities if they have, that countries can be prepared as soon as they present the NDCs, be also in the position to either starting implementing the NDCs or starting getting all the support they need to implement the NDCs. So we needed to focus, to be really laser focused on more ambitious targets, but also on more ambitious means of implementation so that those countries And I would say most of the countries now are really willing to be much more ambitious, but in order to do so, they do need means of implementation to make that next step. For that, COP29 is absolutely vital. So although we obviously talking, in the case of Brazil, we are looking for COP30, as we're going to have the presidency here, but we know that the success of COP29 is absolutely vital for the success of COP30, because the important topic of finance is happening at COP29. It's not the only means of implementation for the NDCs, but it's a very important one. So there will be not, I don't think we'll be successful on COP30 if we are not successful on COP29. And I think we needed to spend a lot of time helping whatever needs for Azerbaijan to be successful in their own COP. So in terms of what Brazil can do, we can also try to lead by example. We do have an NDC that is quite ambitious, that is already economy-wide, we're supposed to be decarbonizing by 53% by 2030, and we wanted to go obviously even more ambitious for 2035. So we at the moment already started our process of developing very detailed plans for implementation of our NDCs, as I said, as investment plans for 2030, and already developing our new targets for 2035. So that's why, David, I think countries like Brazil have not yet looked at for the NDC partnership. I'm sure other countries need even more than us, but we agree with you. A lot of support will be needed for the international community to help countries to develop the NDC in a very strong manner. And I think we need to go, especially for developing countries, beyond thinking about NDCs as a plan that is a niche on their development plan. What we are looking for are development plans that is low carbon, aligned with 1.5, and that are resilient. For developing countries, it's a new way of looking for development that we need, and the NDCs need to be at the center of the development plans that we have. And for that, we need to make sure that it's people-centered, it is a just transition, and that will provide the new prosperity of countries in a low-carbon economy. So that's what we are trying to now, working with our colleagues from the Troika, to be working in this new frame of NDCs, a part of the development programs. And I'm sure by coming on the meeting in Copenhagen soon, that will be hosted by Thomas, we will be able to discuss further both the Troika, but especially the Mission 1.5, and how can we all go together on that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anna. And I think really important what you stressed there about having implementation-oriented, action-oriented, investable, and people-centered NDCs. And with that, I think that's a good note, in fact, to turn to Laura on. The IEA has just hosted its ministerial meeting, which touched in part on the question of how to deliver on the energy and climate commitments from COP28. And one step clearly that's going to be needed is to deliver on the energy components of that outcome. So I want to ask, in the sort of spirit of implementation, what dynamics do we see in the energy sector today that NDCs can build on in terms of things like deployment, technologies, costs, and investment?
Thank you very much, David, and thank you to WRI for hosting this important meeting. It seems that 20th of February is the date that everyone is starting to really think through NDCs, and let me really acknowledge that this morning our executive director hosted Toni that is here, and I really want to thank her once again for having gotten up really early to join the meeting together with Sultan Al Jaber, together together with Denmark and Minister Jorgensen and our Azeri colleagues. So we're really starting to move beyond COP28 and really moving strongly towards COP29 and COP30. I would like to maybe articulate this next couple of minutes on one very simple premise, which is the following. We put forward the first nationally determined contributions 10 years ago. And for what concerns the energy sector, 10 years ago is almost a century ago. We are in a completely different world. So Tarin started with, I think, a very, very important data, and we have very similar analysis. When we went into signing the Paris Agreement, we had expectations of a certain CO2 emission trajectory. Today, for 2030, we have shaven off around 6 gigatons. This is not a small number. And if you look at those 6 gigatons, 5 of that 6 gigatons are shaven off because of solar, wind, bioenergy, electric vehicles. So this is the past. We have already achieved that. Countries going into the next round of NDCs really need to integrate that this energy world is different. Last year, this is data, is not projections. In 2023, 90% of the capacity additions in the world of electricity generations were low carbon. The large majority of it, solar, wind, renewables. 1 in 5 vehicles sold globally was an electric vehicle. So we are in a clean energy revolution. It's happening. Now, going forward, what we achieved, thanks to the great leadership of Minister Jorgensen and many others in the global Stocktake. Thomas mentioned that all that the IEA had put forward has been achieved. I would say that many things that we had put forward have been achieved. So certainly we are incredibly happy that the tripling of renewables, doubling of energy efficiency, meet and pledge, transitioning away from fossil fuels, they're all there. And why is it so important? Why was it so important for us? Is that those pieces, if we implement them, they would give us still a chance to be in a trajectory that is 1.5 degrees compatible. Now, 2 points. First, what are we seeing on the ground in terms of industries? A couple of years ago, you may know, we did this net zero by 2050 analysis, and we started looking at the type of deployment we needed to see on solar, on batteries, on electric vehicles, on minerals. Today, we are tracking what companies are doing in terms of investments on the ground. And the numbers are really, honestly, incredible. Today, we look at the plans for solar manufacturing production to 2030. We have more than enough to be fully aligned with the 1.5 degree trajectories. On batteries and electric vehicles is exactly the same. 2 years ago, this was unthinkable. So what is really happening on the ground, these are really industrial opportunities. It's about growth, it's about economic growth, it's about jobs. It's happening. Now, is all good? No. So we had a 5th item that we thought was incredibly important and didn't come across. And so we are very happy that the Azeri and Brazil are putting finance and just transitions at the center. Why? I think it's important to have one number in mind. Since the Paris Agreement to today, clean energy investment grew from 1 trillion to 1.8 trillion. This is not fully aligned with what we would need to be if we were 1.5 aligned. But the most important thing is that this incredible growth from 1 trillion to 1.8 trillion happened only in a handful of countries. It's happening in the US, it's happening in Europe, it's happening in China. But if you look at the emerging markets and developing economies, the investment is completely flat. So it's a very unequal distribution of access to clean energy. So the financing piece and the just transition piece really need to be front and center now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think really important points about the need to really spread the investment much more widely to those parts of the world that right now aren't receiving it. I wanted to turn back to Thomas. Anna mentioned leading by example, and I wanted to get your thoughts on the European Union, what its plans are. Just recently, the European Commission announced a proposal for 90% reductions by 2040, and then would derive the 2035 target for the NDC from that. So I wanted to ask, from your perspective, what policies and actions does that NDC need to reflect? What should be in the NDC in order to achieve that level of ambition? And also, can your ambitious proposed target be a sort of starting point for diplomacy around NDCs and where we get to by Belem?
Thank you, David, and happy to engage on where Europe might be going, although probably you should have someone from the European institutions here to answer that question, given that it's an EU Commission proposal that you're referring to. But before I go there, if I may, could I just pick up the thread from Anna and Laura on the financing piece before I go to the next NDC, because I do think that it's extremely important that we develop the same collaborative spirit around the financing that we found in 2023 on the energy transition. And I think we had both energy and forest goals where there were partnerships developed around renewable energy, deforestation, stopping, even methane or carbon management, and certainly also part of the fossil fuel challenge. Denmark is leading a coalition on going beyond oil and gas that's trying to also put on the table the discussion on a managed transition out of fossil fuels, so that it doesn't become the heated debate that we have at COPs, but more a discussion on what are the pathways to transition out of fossil fuels. And I'm saying this that in this year on finance, exactly to make sure that we get the transition of a financial system that also allows flows to go to the wider spread of developing countries beyond the few G20 large countries that have the capacity to attract the investment. We need to have a look at the engine room of the financial system, the financial architecture. We need to look at all the different instruments that we apply. We need to build the bridges and create the alliances across North and South to implement new ideas. And then, of course, we also need to look at the concessional finance, the new quantified goal that will be at the heart of COP29. But I do think that we need a comprehensive approach to financing where we look at all the different elements. Taxation has been proposed, debt management, credit rating institutions, et cetera, et cetera. And I think only by breaking down the financing piece into its various components can we start then also coming up with solutions that will allow us to create those investments that go to the wide range of countries that need to attract them. And in a way, the NDC work, now getting to your question, David, is very much about creating the NDC 2.0 that can become an investment plan and serve as a way for countries to attract the investments. And the European Union hopes to be leading on the NDC ambition. The proposal from the Commission is to set a target of 90% at least reduction by 2040. That is building on the 55% reduction by 2030. That is the EU's current target. It is a proposal because we are going to have European elections in June this year. So we will have to have a new European Parliament. There will be a new European Commission, and then they will put forward the proposal for the European legislation based on this proposal, and that can then be adopted sometime around this time next year. So it is a rather lengthy process that the EU will be going through politically, but the proposal of a 90% target is one that many governments have already welcomed. And in our point of view, all sectors in the European economy will have to contribute to reach this target. We have the European emission trading that is also core of our approach. We have strong standards. regulatory requirements. And the hot potato for Europe, also given the manifestations of farmers in recent weeks, will going to be agriculture. And there's no way of beating around the bush that emissions from agriculture and land use and the biosphere will also be key in lowering our emissions. And that's where we need the close collaboration with Brazil, where forestation and land use is also a major issue. And again, as I said before, this has to be a collaborative approach where we develop our way forward together, and also in a way that it's favorable to our economies and that doesn't tank them. We need to generate a meaningful green transition, and we hope that with our ambitious NDC in hand, we can work with Brazil to approach other major economies, US, China, other G20 countries, but then also work through, as I said, the NDC partnership to help also developing countries and vulnerable economies do their NDCs. And Anna, we would very much welcome Brazil to become active in the NDC partnership. Maybe you should even join us as co-chair. Rwanda leaves at the end of this year, so there's a position open for you.
Thanks, Thomas. Let me actually turn to Anna again on a couple fronts. One is on the investment and finance front. And in addition to your role as hosting COP30, you're also hosting the G20 this year. So wanted to get your thoughts on where we might go in multiple contexts on the finance and investment front. And then maybe we can come back to, but I did want to ask you about the nature and land use issues that Thomas was raising.
Thank you. And yes, Thomas, let us talk about that. It could be perhaps interesting as we are in the middle of this process. But yes, Brazil is hosting G20 this year. And as perhaps some of you have realized, there's a few innovations that Brazil tried to bring to G20. One of them is making climate a cross-cutting issue in almost every working group, not only on the finance track, but also on the Sherpas track. Most of the working groups have a climate lens to it. So as we do it in the national policy that climate change is a cross-cutting issue among 18 ministries, we thought it would be interesting to do the same at G20 at the working groups. The second innovation that President Lula is bringing is that normally the G20, you have those two tracks, the Sherpas track and the finance track. This time, Brazil is proposing to have two task forces, and that the task force perhaps represents very much the vision that Brazil wants to play on the G20. There's two task forces. One is combating poverty and inequality, and the second one is combating climate change. So I think that gives a taste of what we, how we feel that G20 is totally aligned to the plans that we just talked about in terms of the work that needs to be done in the NDCs. Those are two big tasks, fighting inequality and poverty, as well as combating climate change, that have the pillar of Brazil's development agenda at the moment. And what we have seen and are proposing in the G20, David, in this task force, is that some countries, unfortunately, not many yet, but in Europe, you had the new Green Deal, in the US, you had the RRA, Brazil has the ecological transformation, which are, and obviously in China, the ecological civilization plans that they do every 5 years. So some countries are already bringing climate resilience from within national plans. And I think what we are trying to have the discussion on the G20 is how those national plans become platforms for aligning investments, both national investment as well as international investment in countries. how can we help other countries to develop their own development path in their own way to do the same? So this is the debate that Brazil is proposing at G20 Task Force on Climate Change. And we are very much looking forward to have that discussion in an extended G20, that we have the G20 plus. Brazil has invited many friends and other countries and colleagues and agencies to be part of that debate. And we feel that this perhaps will be helping us, especially thinking about COP29, to think what is not just the 100 billion Gs or 120, 200, God knows which number we will end up of the money that needs to be mobilized, public money from developed countries for the next COP. But what's the financial system fit for a 1.5 world? What does it look like? How can we think about, as we're doing on the carbon world, what are the new economic instruments that we need to think about? What is the price of investment in emerging and developing countries? How can we make the cost of investment be lower? I already talked about here debt swap. So I think now the concentration of looking at those investment and finance issues are going to be key to look into the success of the next generations of NDCs. That background needs to be there. And I think we only know there are two things that we have at the moment against us. One is time. Yes, time is so precious. So we need collectively find ways to speed up actions in the places that are most likely to enable to speed up those actions. And obviously, the second one is money. So how can we redirect money for those places that can go faster and also cheaper to go there, rather than trying at the same time as if we don't have the constraints of time. So I think constraint of time in relation to finance needs to be on the forefront of our concerns.
Thank you very much. And I think that emphasis on how do you do things like reducing the cost of investment, cost of capital are so critical, and having investable plans. I wanted to turn to Laura on that front, actually. If you could give us a sense of what do you think are the things that could go into NDCs that would in fact make them investable? What are the elements that countries should have in mind as they construct their NDCs?
So thank you, David. I will answer this question if you allow me. Maybe I will actually also share something that the executive director shared this morning in terms of IEA. What do we think we will do this year to support all the different efforts from, of course, Azeri G20 and from Brazil, and then the COP30. So going back to the question on NDCs, I think here we have really started thinking how we can support the next round of NDCs, and we fully agree with what has been said, mentioned by Anna, by Thomas, and I think several others. Those NDCs need to be investment plans, especially for the energy sector. If we put ourselves, well, we will be in 2025, 2035 should be the year that we will be discussing about NDCs. Any investment and infrastructure that we will build from now to then, we will still be operating in 2050. So it is absolutely has to be compatible with, as it is said in the GST, it has to be in line with science or compatible with the 1.5 degree trajectory. So there will be a few things that are going to be needed. First of all, started trickling down the tripling of renewables and doubling of energy efficiency and the methane pledge. This is the first thing that countries will need to think through. So integrating those in their plan to 2035. How does this global goal, what does it mean for 2030 and then for the 2035 target? And again, I think we need to go beyond the target setting. It's going to be really investment plan setting. We also see a very deep need that those continue to be nationally determined. The world does not look alike in all places in the planet. The differentiation and the country's circumstances will matter hugely. So while we have a global trend that we should look at in 2035 in terms of emission abatement, we will see many different numbers in that very year. And really, we will be looking at G7, G20 countries and the major economies this year and at the beginning of the next, really setting the pace and the example. One final thing, David, I think at the beginning you mentioned last week we had our ministerial meeting at that we took the opportunity to release some new analysis on weighted average cost of capital that different economies in the world are seeing when they're borrowing money to do energy investments. And the result is a bit frightening, to be honest, because last year, and this is again data, emerging economies were borrowing money for clean energy projects at rates that were 2 to 3 times higher than advanced economies. So we are basically making those technologies unaffordable for the emerging world. So this has to really be front and center. Now, I will conclude with what our executive director announced this morning. What are we going to work on? First, it's going to be about tracking. We know that tripling, doubling methane have been agreed upon. We want to make sure that countries have actually will do what they have pledged last year, and we will do this in cooperation with UNFCCC. The second is really we want to support countries in develop their NDCs, in particular, of course, their energy part. Third, I think Thomas said it very, very well and eloquently. Last year, we were able to achieve consensus on a lot of the energy parts. There were a lot of high-level dialogues that were built. We would like to continue to do so. And this morning it was discussed also with Anna that maybe we could support the Troika in doing these high-level dialogues. Fourth is certainly going to be continue the work on finance at our end from the energy sector perspective. And I want to add a fifth thing that the executive director announced that links to the equity and fighting poverty consideration. So in sub-Saharan Africa today, 4 out of 5 families are still cooking with fuel wood, and fuel wood that is used is basically cutting forests. Gender issue, second reason of mortality in Africa. We are hosting in Paris on the 14th of May with the President of Tanzania, Prime Minister of Norway. The Executive Director had the pleasure to discuss with this in Brazil with Anna, but also with President Lula. Huge interest there. I think this has to be another way to engage with the emerging world and put front and center their needs. So how do we solve the clean cooking issue? I think I will stop here and happy to come in later in the Q&A. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And let me actually use that as an opportunity to come to Anna now on the questions around nature and land use and agriculture that we've now heard from both Thomas and Laura.
Yeah, on nature, I mean, obviously having a COP in the Amazon will make nature a very, we are hoping anyway, a very important topic of the negotiations that we're going to have. From our perspective, first of all, bringing the Biodiversity Convention, the goals and targets, and the climate goals and targets, how we can bring them together. Also the instruments, we are talking about NDCs, but at the Biodiversity Convention, we are also doing similar national plans related to biodiversity, or SNAPSs. So how can we integrate both instruments of planning together? How can we do that? These are some of the, obviously, the goals that we have in bringing and suggesting for COP30. But I think one of the big issues that will be coming, and it's already there, reforestation is already a key topic that we know we all are working, each countries are working. Can we do something together? Can we do something bigger together that goes just beyond some of the pledges that we have seen? We believe that should be the case. The same about conservation areas and indigenous people's lands. This is a big topic for Brazil, as probably many of you know. And as you could see, David, I haven't even mentioned stopping deforestation. Because Brazil does have an extremely ambitious target of stopping to be zero deforestation by 2030. We saw that that came into the COP28, has already suggestion for all countries to also create targets for zero deforestation by maximum 2030. We are absolutely committed to make sure that those plans exist, but not just the plans, but going back to what I just said, do countries have the means of implementation to stop deforestation in their countries? At the same time, ensuring the prosperity of vulnerable people that at the moment live off some of the forest goals. So I think more than any other topic, the issues of people-centered needs to be brought to all goals that we have on the land use sector. We are doing our homework in Brazil, again, trying to lead by example, where the deforestation rates in Brazil last year diminished 50% compared to the year before. We are working very, very hard to decline that as quickly as possible. And we are only able to do that because of the traditional people, because of the indigenous people that working side by side with the government on that goal. So that those topics will be absolutely key for Brazil on the COP coming up on COP30 at the center of it. And let me just use, as I have the mic, to thank the International Energy Agency, Laura, and obviously Dr. Biro, not only for this morning, but for all the help that you have given already for all of us, but for COP28. And we are very much looking forward, continue that working under Troika and obviously under the Brazilian presidency. Was absolutely vital, the work that you guys are doing. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And if I could follow up just really briefly on that, I'm wondering, do you think that that zero deforestation target that a number of countries have committed to, including at Glasgow, is something that should be incorporated into NDCs? Or are there other ways to that countries should be thinking about how to incorporate nature and land use issues into their NDCs?
I mean, as Thomas well put it, NDCs is nationally determined. So obviously we cannot impose on countries what they will be putting in their NDCs or how they can put that on NDCs. The consensus of the Emirates had an agreement of doing everything possible to stop deforestation global all over the world by 2030. So the target is there. And as with all the other targets, we need to highlight them, so countries have the opportunity to say how they're going to contribute in achieving that target that was set at the UAE consensus. So I hope countries will do that, but we cannot obviously impose. And again, we needed to make sure that they have the means of implementation, because many and I'm not saying that as an excuse, but in terms of economics, if you see, most countries have deforest their forest, developed, and then reforest. So what we are trying to do, countries like Brazil that have a very big forest, is to do a leapfrog, that you don't need to deforest and then reforest, you just keep the forest standing. That's our goal, and I'm sure is the goal of other forest countries, especially tropical forest countries. At the same time, we need to preserve the right of especially vulnerable people for that prosperity. So we need to have strong forest targets at the same time to create value in protecting the forest. And at the moment, we don't have economic instruments that value standing forests. And that's a big, big problem. And I'm not just saying carbon. Carbon market will come, but beyond carbon, protecting biodiversity, protecting ecosystems. At the moment, the economic instruments that we have are not valued. And that's a problem for countries that have, obviously, a lot of nature involved. So that's a work to be done. And I'm sure WRI will be helping all of us to come up with some smart instruments on that.
As best we can, indeed. I want to turn to questions and answers in a moment, but first, just one last round with all of you. One question on issues around just transition and equity. And this has popped up in a few of your comments. So just wanted to get a sense whether you see the NDCs as an opportunity to address questions like just transition and equity issues. Bearing in mind they're nationally determined, but are there some ways in which countries might think about that? And let me start with Thomas, and then we'll go around.
Sure, absolutely, David. The way we approach nationally the energy transition piece, including our decision to end oil and gas production in the North Sea, in the Danish part of the North Sea, has been through a just transition lens, where the decision was taken in consultation with both the major town, the community where the oil and gas industry is housed and where the workers are, also with the unions, and frankly also with the oil and gas industry, with the sector, so that we do a transition from oil and gas to offshore wind, which actually creates more jobs than the oil and gas industry and more revenue streams to the local communities. And by having sort of an integrated approach to that, I think it is possible to enable the just transition of the labor force and not have that to be a contradiction in sort, but it does take a serious engagement at local level with the community to do so. And we can see in other parts of the world where Denmark is engaged in the just energy transition partnerships that G7 countries have created with South Africa, with Vietnam and Indonesia. It is complicated, and especially in South Africa, the coal miners and the coal mining industry is in a lot of trouble, and it takes some very hard work to actually get through that transition, because with the mines there are also schools, social institutions, a whole social network. So it does take a lot of government and local community planning to do that just part. Which is also why, let me just add that we very much agree with Brazil when we talk about combining the development plans and the climate plans. And in fact, I think for most governments, having to do a development strategy and a climate strategy doesn't make a lot of sense, because your planning authority, your finance ministry, your industry, they look at it as one whole. And in a way, the fact that we've gone off on two different tracks, and now, as you say, Anna, a third track with biodiversity, that doesn't reflect the way governments work, where you do one plan that is comprehensive, that has the social, the economic, and the climate and biodiversity aspects in it. And if you don't think those pieces together, you won't really succeed. So in a way, when we think about the NDCs 2.0, we also have to think of them as comprehensive plans for national development. And that's how we are trying to go about it in Denmark and the European Union, but definitely also how we approach working with the countries where we are trying to help on the transition. And on that, yes, Laura, energy transition is the big thing for the next 10 years. Every dollar we invest in energy infrastructure determines how our energy landscape looks in 2050. But likewise, we have been a bit negligent on nature. And in fact, we haven't developed the same breadth of solutions on nature transition as we have on energy. And I think I agree very much with Anna. That is where we as a global community need to work together now on developing methodologies, because the farmers who who go on strike and block the Brussels or Paris. They will do that in every European capital if we don't have forward-leaning solutions when we go to our next NDC in Europe. And I'm sure the same will be the case in Brazil or anywhere else. The farming communities are very strong and also have a word to say, and you need to engage them in the conversation on this. Thanks.
Thank you. So a new dimension to just transition in some ways that we need to start thinking through. Let me throw the same question to you on opportunities and NDCs to address these issues.
I think, I mean, obviously, as we all know, there is a Just Transition Working Group at the UNFCCC that has now a work plan for the next 2 years. So that will end also at the end of COP30. And we feel that's a really, really important debate, whatever just transition is. And the debate among what is just transition is that we only look at from brown jobs to green jobs, as Thomas just mentioned about South Africa, or do we go beyond, which is protecting vulnerable people from climate change that are already vulnerable. So I think we are still in that debate. But in terms of the national plan that we are doing here, first, we see just transition starting by the planning cycle. How do we involve people into developing our NDCs or low carbon development plans? How do we involve people? How participatory those plans are? Because just transition is not something that you do, we can do just from not listening to people that are going to either lose their jobs or are most vulnerable. So what we are doing at the moment is very much listening what just transition for our own NDC would look like, and ensuring in our plans we will have 8 mitigation plans and 15 adaptation plans, and looking at all those plans, how they can incorporate whatever just transition for specific plans look like. So I'm not sure if we're going to be able to have an overall view at the end of this process, or one view of what justice transition is for all the sectors. Doesn't look the same. They probably will look different. And I think we needed to be much more participatory on talking to people to see what a good transition is on that. And in the end, we do have a global problem, but we have local solutions for that global problem. Laura mentioned that in her intervention. So for those local solutions, we really need now to go from the global to the national, to the regional, to the localities, the territories, and see how those plans affect people's real life. If we are not able to do that, again, as was mentioned, if you go either too fast or too slow, because we may have huge political setbacks. If there are farmers today that protest, will be truck drivers, as we had in France, will be young people. So if we don't involve all, we will get a pushback, and we needed to bring people with us in developing the plans that needs to be developed and showing the emergency that we are all going through already.
Thank you. And I think incredibly important to emphasize that participatory aspect. We're going to turn to questions and answers now. We have a plethora of questions, great questions. So we're not going to get to turn to all of them, but I did want to start with some of them. And let me start actually coming back to you, Anna, just on adaptation. Thomas mentioned it as a key part of NDCs, and I wanted to get your reflections on that as well, adaptation as a component of NDCs, and happy to get reflections from either Thomas and Laura as well, but go ahead on.
Yeah, I mean, as I said before, for us, adaptation is absolutely part of our climate plan or our low carbon development plan. We are developing 15 sectorial plans, each of the plans led by the different ministries. So the indigenous minister will be leading indigenous peoples adaptation plan, or energy minister with for the energy adaptation plan. So we are putting that very much at the center of our climate plans. Mitigation, giving as much weight for mitigation as adaptation. We see mitigation as the first step to adaptation, and see adaptation as the first step to loss and damage being something that I expect all of us wanted to avoid as much as possible. So in that respect, adaptation is absolutely key for us. And I think there's a lot of homework to be done, because I agree that we spent much more time on mitigation than adaptation. Not that those things are linked, they're very much part of the same goal, but people are already suffering. Climate change is already with us. We already have people dying, thousands of them, either because of too much rain or too much heat. So we do need to bring adaptation plan. I think there are problems there. Adaptation finance, the concept of adaptation finance, how do we calculate what the definition of adaptation finance nowadays? I think it's we needed to do some work on that adaptation finance. We need to have better indicators on how we're going to be looking. And I think what we ended up on adaptation goals at COP28 is, I think, is an expression of how far behind we still are on adaptation. And I think we will need to speed up that process and put much more effort on that, because otherwise we'll be all of us just having to talk about loss and damage very, very soon. So to avoid that, let us talk about mitigation, be ambitious on mitigation, but be as ambitious on adaptation as we can as well.
Yeah, thank you. I think the note on loss and damage is interesting. I think there will be questions about some countries putting loss and damage into their NDCs as well. If we have time, maybe we can come back to that. A question that we have for you, Thomas, has to do with who should take action, which countries need to take the greatest action, how to think through that perennial question. There's obviously a set of major emitters that are critical to the emissions reductions we need. There are questions around historical responsibility, of course. How should we, with this next round, think through those questions?
Well, thank you for the viewer asking that question. The question of who takes action is a bit sometimes academic and theoretical, because in a way everybody needs to take action on mitigation and adaptation. For example, as Anna just highlighted, on adaptation, most countries, even the most vulnerable, cannot wait. They have to act now and make serious investments into protection, because climate change is already happening now. Sea levels are rising, precipitation is rising, droughts are rising, etc., etc. If I just check my own country, this winter, we have had 30% more rainwater than on the average of the last 10 years. So Denmark has been in a constant state of inundation, flooding, people's houses, basements, our roads, our fields, everything has been flooded this winter. And it's just a pretty, I mean, that's just a precursor of what's to come. So it's not only in developing countries, but also in developed countries. So in that sense, everybody needs to take action. When it comes to mitigation, clearly there is an expectation and also a commitment from developed countries to act first. So that's written into the Paris Agreement. But I would also say that many developing countries actually stand to gain by taking action. You saw that, for example, in the approach taken by President Ruto in Kenya at the African Summit last year, where he said that Africa also should reap the benefits of the opportunities from the transition. And Laura just highlighted to us where the investments are going, how the electric vehicle transition is going, the batteries. And I think President Ruto for Africa has highlighted a vision where Africa also becomes a leader in the transition. So it doesn't wait for developed countries to go first. And I think we are at that cusp, at that tipping point in the transition, where you sort of sector by sector, technology by technology, actually can start to see developing countries also benefiting from going first and investing in technologies that can drive it. And I think that's where the obligation on countries like mine then also is to help with the technology transfer, with the knowledge transfer. We are engaged in more than 20 countries on energy transition cooperation, where we transfer the skills of how you integrate renewable energy from wind into your grid, how you build a massive scale energy from renewables and so on. We have a very close partnership with Brazil on this, and I think that's where more government-to-government cooperation is actually needed in order to transfer that skill set and that knowledge. And then just one last point on this. The difficulty with the NDCs, the way we have organized ourselves, is that we approach this on a national basis, if you want, on a vertical siloed basis, every country on its own. But the technologies that we require in order to scale the transition, they are horizontal. They have to be developed collaboratively. Not one country can do it alone, whether it's solar, wind, or electric vehicles or batteries or all the technologies that we take. We have to develop them collectively as a global economy, and scale them across national boundaries. And so in a way, the way the NDCs forces us to think and organize goes contrary to the logic of how we actually generate the most action. And that's where we as governments, but also the private sector, investors and civil society, we have to work together in these partnerships to make sure that we scale action across boundaries.
Yes, thank you. And I think that for me raises the question, should there be parts of NDCs that point to those partnerships very specifically? Be interesting to see that incorporated. I have a question we got for Laura, has to do with the fossil fuel transition, or the transition away from fossil fuels, as it's put in the outcome from Dubai. Is that something specifically that you think countries could or should find a way to incorporate into their NDCs? I think you've touched on the renewables side. So the question, I think, is aimed at looking at the fossil side of the equation.
Thank you, David. Maybe I will use this question also to rebound on something that was talked about, people-centered. So for us, the wording on transitioning away from fossil fuel with the just part in front of it as a very clear meaning, which is about a decline in demand for fossil fuels. And once this happens, thanks to the big push of clean energy technologies, of course, there has to be a change in the investment plans. And I would like to come back here to the workers component, and maybe to the definition of what this transitioning away means. I think there is some room for interpretation, and we certainly over time this year we will clarify to the extent possible from our analysis what does that mean. And of course, it doesn't have the same meaning in every part of the world. Especially if you are a producing countries, so it has different meanings. I want to come back to the people-centered part, because here the workers in coal, oil, and gas are the ones that are going to be affected and are being affected now. And we have been having here at the IEA a commission that looks at a people-centered, and I think that there are a few lessons that we draw out of it. And maybe it comes back to Thomas' point. Thomas was saying that there are some elements that needs to be nationally determined, but the exchange across countries matter. When we were sitting around this table, exchanging, seeing, for example, lessons from Spain and South African head of labor sitting across the table, there was a real exchange of information. And when we look at if policies on just transitions are being implemented, is a bit disappointing. So if we look at coal, for example, there are around 4 million coal workers around the world today, but only 6% of them live in countries or communities that have just transition policies in place. So this is worrying. We know how to do just transition policies in place, but we're not yet doing it. So there is really a need for scaling up. And if you look at the oil and gas sector, the war is slightly different. We see that even in countries where you will see eventually a decline in the amount of jobs in oil and gas, there is huge opportunities in the clean energy sector for moving those engineers, installers, etc., in the clean energy part, and there will be jobs there. However, if you look at how many countries are putting in place skilling and reskilling policies, we are falling short. So I think that there is really some collective work to be done there if we want this to then trickle down in the nationally determined contributions and plans.
Thank you. Yes, a lot of work to do there, I think, to bring it to the ground and to scale it. Absolutely. Want to turn to Taryn. We had a question. You had mentioned long-term strategies and alignment of NDCs. So wanted to ask about that, and what do countries in fact need to do to align their NDCs with long-term strategies? And there's also a call in the outcome from COP28 for countries to update their long-term strategies this year. So what does that also mean?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that most countries now have set targets to achieve net zero emissions, typically by somewhere around mid-century. The NDCs we currently have are targeting the year 2030, and this next round of NDCs will target the year 2035. So the question is, what bridges that gap between where we are now, where we're going over the next decade, and where we ultimately want to get to through this very big transition of the energy sector and also every other sector by the middle of the century? And long-term strategies are an instrument envisioned in the Paris Agreement to help countries plan out that transition with a view toward the very distant future and where we ultimately need to be. And I'm saying the very distant future because it feels that way now, but as I think was noted earlier, when it comes to infrastructure and investment, 2050 is actually not the very distant future. We're talking about investing in infrastructure that lasts for many decades. So we really do need to be planning for that today. So long-term strategies are a way for countries to do that. I think a number of countries have developed long-term strategies that include their net zero targets. They've done that to varying levels of detail in terms of really planning out the transition pathway and the investments and et cetera that need to be managed. Most of them have room to go deeper on that and will need to be doing that very actively, including integrating those plans with development planning so that it doesn't become siloed just in the Environment Ministry. I think for countries that have done a robust job of putting in place long-term strategies that go out to net zero, that detail the transition pathways at the sector level in terms of investments, et cetera, they should have a much easier time developing NDCs that support that transition because you can a bit work backwards from where we ultimately need to be to how we're getting there to what happens by 2030 or 2035. But that's not the case yet for most countries. And I think I was encouraged earlier that Thomas mentioned the role of the NDC partnership in supporting countries on their NDCs. They also play a role in long-term strategy aligned NDCs and have been helping countries to sort of do that integrated planning out to the long term. And it would be fantastic if more countries would take advantage of that.
Thank you. Extremely important to have that context as the NDCs are developed. I have a question, one pointed question that could go to anybody, but basically it's what exactly does it mean to have an investment plan or investable plans in NDCs? Is it in the NDC? Is it sector specific? Is it general? Is it in the NDC itself or outside the NDC? So any thoughts on that would be welcome. Thomas.
Let me have a first stab at it. I think again, as we said initially, the NDC is a national plan there is no methodology or no form that it has to take. It is up to every country. But roughly, after having done the global stocktake, and if you look at the elements that are in the global stocktake, you get an indication of what is expected of the NDC elements: and energy transition, nature transition, adaptation, etc. And I guess the investment plan would then be based on the planning framework that is in the NDC, then to translate that framework into a number of projects and pipelines of projects. South Africa, when they did the Just Energy Transition Partnership, they had an ambitious NDC. They then did the JETP agreement with the G7 countries. And then afterwards, they have been working for 2 years in developing an investment plan that was then adopted by the South African government last November, just prior to COP, and which is now being rolled out. Other countries like Rwanda, which is co-chairing the partnership, NDC partnership with us, have done it a bit differently, where they did their NDC and then they did an investment plan developed through the Green Fund of Rwanda in collaboration with the World Bank and the IFC and the German Development Agency. And that has a 4-pillar approach that focuses on energy, agriculture, urban development, and local communities. And for each of those tracks, there are then a number of projects that will enable them to achieve their NDC targets. So I think for every government, it's a bit different, and also the composition of mitigation and adaptation will be different. Maybe just while I have the floor on mitigation and adaptation, and Anna spoke a bit to this before, I think if we, through the climate finance process this year, the climate task force, that mobilization task force that Brazil has created, if we manage to unlock some of the barriers to having investments flow more widely to mitigation, energy transition in the global south. And I think that is actually possible. Some of these barriers have been created by ourselves to maybe manage the fallout from the financial crisis 10, 15 years ago. If we have a deep look into the engine room of the financial system and we unlock some of those barriers, we will also be able to raise more financing for adaptation. And in a way, have private capital flow to energy projects that are profitable, and then being able to use public money to adaptation that is maybe more difficult to finance through investment and private sector engagement. And as Denmark, we have decided to use 60% of our public funding in the south to adaptation already as a political target, and maybe even go higher if we manage to unlock the private investment for mitigation. So I think this is a moving piece, and the more ambitious we manage to be on investment into mitigation, the more we can also do on adaptation.
Thank you. And let me give a chance for Anna, Laura, and Taran to share any last thoughts before we close.
I just start saying, first of all, thank you so much. I jumped on what this NDC looks like, but it's exactly what we are trying to do here in Brazil. As was mentioned, each country will do in their own way, but we're doing by sector. So each sector having an investment plan, and not only an investment plan, but looking at regulatory changes that may need for those sectors to go faster, and look at capacity gaps that we need to also invest. So we're looking at means of implementation as a whole to that. But I mean, I think thank you, David and WRI, for organizing this. There is no magic on how we're going to go forward. I think we all trying our best. As was said, who needs to go first is all of us together. The together is a really important part. There is no doubt, and we have the principle of common but differentiated. Obviously, we all agreed on those principles, but I think we also need at looking at common but differentiated from within countries. Now, richer versus poor within countries, we needed to look at those as well. And in the end, there is a moral constraints, an ethical constraints that needs to dominate the debates that we are having. We all need to do much more. We're doing a lot, but we all need to do much more. And I think we need to be spending a much more time on putting our actions into the words that we already talked about. So thank you so much. And I look forward very much working on this NDCs 2.0 with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to it as well. Lara and then Taryn.
Very briefly, just thanking you, David and WRI, for bringing us all together today to start this important reflection, and looking forward to supporting Brazil and Azeri in the NDCs journey this year and beyond. We will, in all our analysis and support, we will strive to continue to be data-driven. So this gives me an opportunity to actually give you an appointment at the 1st of March, where we will be releasing our CO2 emissions for last year and clean energy technology deployment for last year. I think that's going to be a big, important moment to integrate for all countries and reflect on progress that has been made. Thank you again.
Thank you. And over to Taryn for any last thoughts on the shape of this conversation and things we need to take forward.
Thanks so much, David, and all the panelists. It's been a really wonderful conversation. I guess one final thought is that I think the NDCs work best when we think of them not as a document or as a target, but as a process that focuses the attention of governments and other stakeholders on climate, on how it can be integrated with development priorities, on how it can be supported with finance and investment. And we have an opportunity over the next year to really use that process to set countries up to drive action on the ground. But there is an urgency, I think, to start that process right away to make sure that it can do all the things that we've laid out here through the panel in terms of involving all the stakeholders, in terms of developing investment plans, et cetera, collecting all the data, updating it. That takes time and effort, but there's a real opportunity. And so I hope we see countries taking advantage of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Taryn. Extremely important points to take forward. Thank you to the panel very much. We've reached the end of the conversation. It's been an honor and a delight to moderate this discussion. More to come, I'm sure. Just a quick note at the end that we're recording the webinar. It'll be available soon. And thank you again to the panelists. Thank you to the audience, and have a good day.
Thank you, David. Thank you, WRI.